Peter Gothard.
Peter de Klerk, how are you?
Very well, very well. Welcome to the DCQ Podcast Special Sits. I'm very happy to have you on today. And today it's live from Sydney.
Yeah, live from Sydney, Saturday evening, so glad to be with you.
Excellent. So Sydney, Australia, down under, probably, the most international episode I've had so far, distance-wise. And maybe we can start with, Sydney. Is that the place you grew up, or is that the place you sort of ended up due to the profession?
No, I grew up here, grew up in Sydney, just south of Sydney on the beach, and started my career here in the grand age of about 17 in insolvency, turnaround, restructuring right from the beginning. The career took me around the world for a fair bit, but landed back here now and settled here with the family and, love every minute of it. It's a great place to live.
Excellent. So, I understand that earlier today you visited your dad. Did your dad or your, parents or the family have a big influence on the choice of profession you made?
They did, actually. I'll tell you the truth. I actually grew up through university. I wanted to be a chemical engineer. That was what I did. So all my subjects at school were all about becoming a chemical engineer. And my father was a forensic chemist, so I kind of maybe wanted to follow in his footsteps. And I had my heart set on all of this. And then one day he said to me, Peter, do you know what chemical engineers really do? And I said,
well, yeah, if
of course they make new products in the lab. They make new compounds and invent things. And he said, well, some of them do, but a lot of them just monitor processes. And I didn't really know. And he said, I've got a friend who works down at BHP Steelworks just south of Sydney. And he said, I've arranged for you to go down and have a look at what they do. So he took me down about an hour and a half down south of Sydney to a big steelworks and was fabulous, into the control room of the steelworks. And I went into the control room and there's all these guys looking at, there's 40 screens up on the wall and they're all looking at screens and all the screens show all the little processes that are going on. And they were just sitting there. It was dead quiet and they were just sitting there. And every now and then they'd turn a little knob or they'd flick a little switch or tap a few keys, and otherwise they were watching. And we'd stayed there for about 45 minutes or something and nothing really changed. And talked to a couple of them and they said, yeah, our job is we have to be here if something goes wrong. If something goes wrong, it can really go wrong. Really just monitoring the process and making sure everything is in balance so the production runs smoothly. So when I left there, I decided that I didn't want to be a chemical engineer anymore. So I remember in the car on the way back home, my father said, what do you think about that? And I said, well, it's not really what I expected. And he said, well, basically, 99% of the chemical engineers, that's what they do. So,
but so your dad did that as well. He was actually,
he was a forensic chemist, so he worked for the police. Going through crime scenes and trying to pick up the evidence and work out what happened, or what the evidence was in the crime scene, and then taking it to court and presenting it as an expert witness, which was really quite fascinating. But anyway, so I thought, well, I'm going to have to rethink my career here. And so I thought, what am I going to do? It was the last minute. I thought, well, business is probably okay. And what's the best way to get into business? Well, start with a base sort of degree. Accounting's a good degree. Okay, so I sort of lined up for accounting, got into university, then started looking for a job and found a job. Well, I looked at many of them, and most of the accounting firms I went to, they started to explain to me what auditing was and what business services was and what tax was, and that wasn't very exciting, to be honest. And I turned up at a firm called Ferrier Hodgson, and they said, we do this insolvency stuff. And they explained to me what that was all about, and that you go in and you act as the receiver or the liquidator or the administrator, and you take over the business and you nurse it through its difficulties and you turn it around if you can, or you sell its assets. The light bulb was on. I thought, this is what I want to do. And I just fell into it. I took the job immediately. Started there at 17, was there for 30 odd years, and rose up to be the lead partner of the Sydney office. And after being, running practices around the world, and then in 2019 we transferred the business, or merged the business in with KPMG, and became a Big Four partner and running the practice in Sydney for KPMG. Wow. Now running the Asia Pacific business for them. So it's, it's a big journey, but, sometimes you fall into these things by accident. And I'm just really lucky that I had that experience early on. And thanks to my dad for sort of correcting my pathway, or I'd be sitting in a control room with an orange shirt on and a helmet trying to turn knobs to make sure the steel was made properly.
So you the first in the family that sort of did an accounting job? Because I saw that, you started your degree and at the same time you started with Ferrier Hodgson. So
Yeah.
was this like sort of a study work program that they had at the same time?
Yeah, back in those days, they took they called them cadets out of high school, straight out of high school, and sort of sponsored you through your university. So you go to university at night and you work during the day, and they helped us a little bit with university. I think they gave us half a day off a week or something for study. And then, after you got your degree, you then went on, did your professional qualifications, etc. But it was interesting because it got me straight into work right from the beginning, and it gives you a lot of experience, right? Nothing like really learning on the job rather than learning in university, then trying to apply it. And not many
Well,
people do it
exactly.
these days. They don't hire people out of school anymore.
Well, I think the apprenticeship is sort of a thing that is revived again. They want to have people, and I guess in law it is also paralegal is sort of a way into qualifying these days. So there's various ways. But you're a trailblazer in, I guess, what we now call special situations. You're the first in the family that actually trodden that path.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. Otherwise, there's surveyors in the family. There's a paramedic in the family, but I'm the only one in business and finance.
Excellent. So, Farrah Hodgson's, you're sort of a lifer there. And then, in 2019, KPMG had sort of gobbled it up and you're now part of, the big four. Maybe start with sort of the firm itself. From what I understand, it originally is a firm that was primarily focused on formal insolvency. Was that, primarily liquidating stuff, or was it also rescuing stuff? When you started, what was the landscape and how has it evolved, the time you've been there?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. So when I started, Ferrier Hodgson was quite a unique firm. It was the only firm in Australia, at least, and I don't know whether there would have been many in the world, which specialized only in insolvency and restructuring. And it was primarily insolvency then. So it was an accounting firm, but all we did was liquidations, receiverships, and administrations.
And that's something that people believe, it's not cyclical. So is that a business that can sustain on its own, or do you need to have something for the good times as well? I guess that firm has shown that actually you can have it just on insolvency.
Yeah, but it was a struggle. It was a struggle because, as you say, it's cyclical or it's sort of counter-cyclical. But one of my partners gave me some good advice early on. He said, Peter, you can't lose in this business because when the economy is bad, you make money in the business. And when the economy is good, you make money on your house. So save your money, buy the best house you can, sit back and enjoy the ride. And hey, it's worked perfectly well. So you can build your own natural hedges if the business doesn't have them. But I think that the success was that it was a specialized firm for specialized work, and there were it was the big eight accounting firms at that stage who had some expertise in insolvency and restructuring. And in fact, KPMG was probably the strongest one in Australia at the time. And then over the time built, there were a few other firms that saw the benefits of the specialised firm. And we saw Mentha and McGrath-Nicol and PPB come through. And the landscape sort of evolved to the point where you had about 4 specialist firms, and really the big four not doing too much of it. KPMG were the last strong ones, and when Sarbanes-Oxley came out and all the conflicts that came with that, they sold their practice out and it became one of those specialty firms called McGrath-Nicol. And it wasn't until many, many years later that KPMG thought, you know what, we would like to get back into this business because we want to be able to service all of the needs of our clients in good times and in bad times. It's fine to be able to help them when the business is going well. But they also wanted to be able to help clients when they needed a bit of help improving their business, when things were getting a bit rough and they needed to turn their business around. And if things really got difficult, they had to be able to help them if they were in dire straits and, go through some sort of formal restructuring process. And that was the genesis of them coming to us and saying, hey, we want to build a team. Would you come on board? At that point, I said, well, I think if you want to do this properly and you're serious about it, you should merge the whole firm together because we've got a good, strong business with good people. And I can see it fit culturally really well within KPMG. And, that's what happened and that's what's worked. So 6 years later to the day, a couple of days ago, we had a little bit of a celebration. We've been there for 6 years and things are working pretty well. And pretty much the whole team's still there, which I think is testament to the fact that it works.
That's interesting. I guess we'll get to that because it's an interesting decision of one of the big four to sort of go back in it after, I guess, many years of the big four, umming and ahhing whether or not they could have an insolvency practice, whether the conflict sort of prevented it, etc., etc. But KPMG has sort of bit the bullet and moved forward. Can we maybe go back to, I guess, late 80s, early 90s when you started at Ferrier Hodgson's? How big was the firm at that point in time? Was it still only Sydney and Melbourne? Was the practice sort of national or even regional at that point in time?
Yeah, I mean, it started out, it was quite small. I think when I started, it was maybe 35 people in Sydney, and there was a separate Sydney office and a Melbourne office, and they were separate partnerships. They just shared the same name. And then in the late 80s, I sort of joined at a time when there was a bit of a financial crisis in Australia in the late 80s, and there was a boom in work. And before I could turn around, I think Sydney office was up to about 120 people, so 4 times the size. And wow. we had some really big. We had a big investment bank which was out of Perth, which was keeping us going, and so the firm really expanded. And Melbourne pretty much did the same. And after a while, the partners worked out that it didn't make a lot of sense to have a separate offices in separate cities. So they merged Sydney and Melbourne. And then after we digested that merger, then we merged the other offices around the country. So Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth and Canberra, we merged them all together into one practice, which gave tremendous benefits in terms of scale and sharing of resources and not competing with each other. And then after we'd worked pretty hard to expand up into Southeast Asia, which I was a fair part of, eventually we merged those in together. So I had one sort of semi-international regional practice.
Wow. And because, Australia has its own market, but is also part of, I guess, sort of, the South Asian sort of market as well. So you opened offices in a number of places outside of Australia. But did you go to one of those offices yourself, or did you always stay in Australia itself?
Yeah, so the firm pretty early on opened an office in Hong Kong, and sent a few people up there, and it worked really well. And then when I think it would have been the 97, 98 Asian financial crisis, I was sitting in my office in Sydney, and the managing partner, Ian Ferrier, came around and sort of stuck his head in the door and said, "Do you feel like a trip up to Asia?" And I said, "Sure, I'm happy to go." "How long for?" And he said, "Oh, a couple of weeks." I said, "Where to?" And he said, "Bangkok." I said, "Okay, yeah, that sounds all right." He gave me the name of a guy. "You call this guy, he'll set it up for you and take a couple of people and away you go." So I went up there. It was just before Christmas, I think, in late 97, when the Thai baht was pegged to the US dollar, and they couldn't hold the peg. And so when the currency slipped, it created quite a crisis in that country. And so I started working there for we had a role with one of the banks on a big petrochemical company, the largest integrated petrochemical complex in Southeast Asia, I think called Thai Petrochemical Industry. And we're working on it. It was a difficult case. It had 140 different banks. 100 of them were bilat, and 40 of them were in an IFC syndicate. I think the total debt was about $4 billion US, so pretty decent size for that long ago.
Absolutely.
And, operating in a country where there was no insolvency law, no bankruptcy law at all. So we started working there, and took about a year to draft a restructuring plan.
And what was your role? Were you assisting the company? Were you assisting the shareholders? Were you assisting, a conglomerate of the banks?
Yeah, we were assisting the banks. So there was 140 banks, and we shuffled that down to, I think, a steering committee of about 30 banks, which was still too big. And then we had a working group of about 12. So you had to sort of do things with, the lawyers and ourselves working really closely together, formulate the plan, working with the company to get the information, sell it to the working group, have the working groups changes. They had to sell it to the steering committee, got the steering committee's changes, and then we had to sell it to everyone. But in the end, I ended up being there for 6 years. So the 2-week trip late in 1997 turned into 6 years, and we built the second biggest Ferrier Hodgson office off the back of that job. think I had 100 and something people at some stage working in Bangkok for me. Yeah, we got Thailand introduced a new bankruptcy law. We were the first ones to use it, and it passed. Much credit to the Thai judiciary and the courts. Everyone said it would never work, but it did work, and we managed to effectively be appointed as administrators over that company, and we ran it for about 4 years. So I got my dream of being a chemical engineer of some way, and I was running a petrochemical complex for 4 years, which was really good fun, and a really big business. Had something like 7,000 employees, so biggest company that I've ever run as an administrator, and learned so much in that time.
And that was early 30s. So
That's right.
this
Yeah.
was an angry young man.
It was a big test. And then when that finished after 6 years, I was sort of looking forward to coming back to Sydney, and the same managing partner, Ian Ferrier, again, phoned me up this time, not stuck his head in my door because we were in a different country, but phoned me up and said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm going to come back. He said, there's not much happening back here. I'll tell you what, I would like to open an office in Japan. Would you be keen to go and have a go at opening an office in Japan? I said, okay, I'll go to Japan. So I packed up, and we went up to Japan and set up a greenfields restructuring practice in Tokyo, together with a couple of senior Japanese people we'd met and recruited. And my deal there was, I said, I'll be here for 4 years, and I'll recruit the Japanese, I'll set the culture, I'll get the business going, and then I'll lead them to it. And that's what happened. So we set up business in Japan. Nice big change from Southeast Asia to Japan, from the chaotic environment to the very ordered and civilized environment. And we did some good work there. We did some good work for the Japanese government, who set up a restructuring authority there. And so the biggest case we worked on was Kanebo, which a lot of people would know as a cosmetics company, but it actually started out as a textile company, and it was one of Japan's oldest companies, I think maybe the oldest corporation. And they made silk and cotton, and then branched into cosmetics later on. So our job was to restructure the Kanebo operations outside of Japan. They wouldn't really let us do the stuff inside Japan, but the foreigners can do the stuff outside of Japan. So we sold the silk businesses that were in Indonesia and in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and then China as well. So we sort of sold or closed or rationalized all of those businesses, making the hard decisions that the Japanese company couldn't really bring itself to do, because it had always seen itself as a textile company, and the cosmetics were something that were on the side. But it was pretty easy to see when you looked at it. They made an awful lot of money in the cosmetics business. That was great. But the textile business was a loss-making business. They just couldn't
historically, I guess, obviously it was a sector.
We are a textile company. We make, that's what we do. We can't close that. And so it wasn't until there was some government intervention to come along and said, no, you're going to close that business, and you're going to expand and put the money into the cosmetics. And look, it's going super well today. I'm sure your wife would know a lot about Kanebo Cosmetics, and we'll be getting advice for you, I think.
But that is an amazing start, getting head on into a cross-border practice from, I guess, Australia, that has its own market, and all of a sudden, the world opens up. You're in the middle of it, and you actually experience, with feet on the ground, 2 jurisdictions there. How would you, describe, I guess, sort of, Australian approach in comparison to the Thai approach and the Japanese approach? And you said, look, in both countries, we were viewed as the foreigners, but, we still managed to, I guess, accomplish what needed to be accomplished. How do you do that? And what do you need to be aware of? And what have you learned by dealing, intensively with 2 different, I guess, Asian cultures that are, probably quite different from the way Australians usually do things?
Yeah, a really good question. I was fortunate in that before I went up to Thailand, I had a little couple of years stint on secondment to our affiliate in the US. So I spent a bit of time living and working in New York. So Southeast Asia wasn't my first time away from home. And it was good because, you learn to appreciate that things are different in different countries and that you need to approach things differently, and people think differently, people act differently. And so that sort of gave me a little bit of a taste of it. But certainly going to Thailand, there's two sort of really big shocks. One is the cultural shock. It's a very, very different culture. And then in the legal system is also a shock in that it's a civil law system, not a common law system that I was used to. And it also doesn't, the rule of law is not quite as stringently followed. And so therefore things are a bit more flexible or done things in a different way. And then go to Japan, of course. When you get to Japan, again, we've got a very ordered society, very different society, and again, a civil system, but one where the rule of law worked really well, probably almost too well because it's extremely rigid. And it was also interesting because in Japan, bankruptcy work is not seen as very prestigious work.
It's because there is still enormous stigma attached to, I guess, financial distress and insolvency.
That's right. That's right. So I think that at the time, and I don't know what the situation is now, but there were only something like 20 bankruptcy trustees. So in Japan doing all the work. They're lawyers, they're not accountants, but a very small number of practitioners doing that work. But, those two things, the cultural adaptation and then adapting to different legal systems and the different application of the law are things that, you really have to adapt to.
And how did you do that?
I think a lot of listening and a lot of effort to try and understand other culture. And I think the people who do well in other jurisdictions are the ones that can understand and accept that things are done differently, and that your way is not necessarily the best way. Your way is not the only way. Their way is their way, and you may think it's not as good as your way, but it doesn't matter. That's the way it is. And I think once you start to learn that and understand that, that's the basis of starting to be able to work in that country. There's no point trying to fight a system. And in fact, you'll end up looking foolish and you'll end up failing. So one of the great...
And do you need to know the language, or can you actually achieve things in English?
Yeah, some would call me stupid for going to two countries where I didn't speak the language. It does make things a challenge.
But you like a challenge, right? Maybe that's why that's one of the characteristics of longevity in this field, is that you're not afraid to actually take on a challenge.
Yeah. And you have to be. But look, both countries, a lot of business is done in English anyway. But both countries are also very proud of their heritage and their language and their system, right? So again, part of adaptation, you can't go to a meeting in Thailand and expect that it's all going to be in English. You have to find a way to be able to deal with it. I didn't speak the language when I got there, and I still wouldn't say that I speak much of it at all. But you do start to absorb, parts of the language and parts of the culture, and then you surround yourself with staff who are multilingual and can help you out in getting those things through. But it's a real challenge here.
And do you think that it was a benefit for you to do it at a relatively early age or early in your career? Because, if I look back, it's sort of youthful ignorance is bliss, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you have a lot of confidence and you can do a lot of things simply because you're unaware of all the, the dangers that if you're walking on the edge of the ravine, but you actually don't know that, you can walk pretty comfortably on that edge. And I feel like, looking back, there were definitely times that I did that. And I assume that, maybe that was also a little bit the case for you in this, quite challenging environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Starting with the managing partner sticking his head in the door and say, feel like a trip to Asia, my answer was, yeah, straight away. I wasn't sort of thinking, where am I going and how long, I just went into it. And look, that was it was better that it was at a younger age, I think, for all the reasons you say. I mean, there were a lot of challenges when we were in Thailand. I mean, there were a lot of legal challenges, but, there was we were doing something which was very difficult and hadn't been done before. And people said, you'll never be able to do it, because the owners of the businesses we would take over were quite senior, quite powerful, politically powerful, socially powerful. And for foreigners to come in and be appointed as the administrator and taking over the operation of the company, that is very unheard of. And we tried to do that as sensitively as we could, but at the end of the day, you're still taking control of the company away from the founders, and that causes them a certain amount of loss of face, and quite understandably, they're unhappy. And unfortunately, while we were up there were incidents, thankfully not on the job we were working on, but on another one where one of the administrators from one of the big four was shot and killed.
Wow.
in doing the job because of the resentment of the owners of the company or other interested parties. I'm not exactly sure who was behind it. There was a tough environment. So we had security, personal bodyguards all the time we were there. And, lots of incidents. It made it very difficult for us to keep staff. I mean, there was a certain time when anyone who had kids, we said, you're going back home, you're not working on this matter anymore. So it was only the single people who could stay because we were worried about people's families. So yes, you could only really do it at the younger stage. And yes, it's a challenge and you need to be resilient about it. If you had more brains, you probably would have thought this is crazy and I'm going to leave and go home right now and the banks can try and get their $4 billion back some other way. But, you're there to do a job, you're in the middle of it and, you do what you have to do as a professional.
Yeah. And so you were appointed there yourself, under the system. So a foreign, I guess, IP could get a role as an administrator in Thailand.
Yeah, we were the first ones. And it was very surprising to people that this could happen. And maybe not so much that it was foreigners, but because remember, there were no people practicing turnaround and restructuring. There were no IPs there at all because there wasn't an insolvency system. So the Thai government had to introduce this new legislation, design a whole new insolvency system, a whole new bankruptcy court. They set up a whole new branch of the court.
How did they, Pete? How did they deal with insolvency then before? Was it something that it was just abandonment of situations, or it was all done, I guess, in the shade? Nobody could actually see it, and in the grey spaces. But formally, there weren't any insolvencies because obviously, financial distress is a normal part of the life cycle of a company and you need to address it. And it has everything to do then again with what you discussed also on Japan, that there's such a negative stigma that you don't want to actually deal with financial distress. You're in denial.
I think in the case of Thailand, it had been on such a boom for so long. Like they were raging along, their growth was terrific and the development of the country was terrific. And so I don't think there was very much in the way of insolvency. And if there was, I think it just fell by the wayside and wasn't really dealt with. There wasn't a history of large insolvencies involving certainly foreign companies. I think where there were insolvencies which involved Thai banks, the Thai banks found a way to work it out with the founder because typically the borrower was owned by someone who was of certain standing in the society and the bank owners of the bank were at the same time. So they worked something out and they managed to solve it if it was a big case. And if the small cases just didn't really matter in such a high growth environment. But it wasn't until you had this major crisis, which engulfed the country, from the inability to defend the peg of the baht to the US dollar, it really became an issue. And the other change there was that, at the later years of that boom, and it was really because of the peg of the baht to the dollar, you suddenly had a lot of foreign lenders. So these Thai companies have got really big and they were borrowing money from foreign lenders as well as from local lenders. And you can see with this company, this TPI, 140 banks, 100 of them bilats. And I did ask the founder and the owner one time, I said, with respect, how did you end up borrowing money from 140 different people? And he said, Peter, you've got to understand, I would walk out of a bank, the head office of a bank, having just signed a $200 million loan for stage 3 of part of my complex. And I'd run into another banker who'd say, Kun Prachai, when are you coming to see me? There's $300 million of loans sitting on my desk ready for you. When are you going to come and borrow some money from me? When are you going to do some business with me? So we'd go and see that person and think, well, if they're going to send me another 300 million, I'll do stage 4. And then on stage 5, stage 6. And so there was a lot of money looking for homes in industrial companies in a fast growing economy like Thailand. And they just borrowed and borrowed and borrowed. So you ended up with a horrible capital structure. I think it was for a lot of these businesses. Not only did they have 140 banks owing $4 billion, but about 60% of that debt was short-term debt. It was due in 1 or 2 or 3 years. And they're using that money to build an oil refinery and a petrochemical complex. But it didn't matter because every time you had to roll the debt, there was someone else that was going to do it. And of course, once you had this currency crisis, shutters came down, stopped. Just like in the global financial crisis, I guess. And suddenly liquidity dropped away and then you have a real problem.
So that's maybe just trying to tie it back to why does insolvency have such a negative stigma? One of the reasons for me is that, well, what you see reported in the press is obviously, the big frauds, right? The Madoff, the Enron, the WorldCom, FTX, and people associate everything with, I guess, fraudsters. But as you just explained in Thailand, it could also be, a geopolitical issue that sort of, triggers a situation where the shutters come down. That is sometimes very hard to predict, and the consequences are severe, and you need to deal with stuff. In your experience, is it more the latter in terms of there are other reasons than fraud why a company goes into financial distress, or have you seen predominantly fraud being part of the demise of the matters that you've been part of?
I mean, in all my whole career, there hasn't been many which have collapsed with fraud. There's been the odd one here and there, and some of the big ones, like that investment bank in Perth I talked about before. That was pretty sharp dealings. But most of it is, I think, either bad management or excessive risk taking, or markets moving away from the company. But I think going to your point about why there's such a stigma, particularly in Southeast Asia, and it's sort of everywhere. Leave the fraud stuff aside. It's loss of face. It's loss of social standing. I mean, remember in Thailand, a lot of these companies are still family-owned companies. So not only does it jeopardize the family fortune, but the big business person, big business family who's running these things suddenly is shown up to be not a very good business person, and that's a massive loss of face for them. And face and reputation in Southeast Asia is huge. In China, it's everything, and in Japan, it still weighs very heavily as well. I mean, if you do something wrong in Japan, though, there's a huge amount of shame, and that's not something that society deals with well for them. So, and I think this goes for all developing economies too. I mean, the US is in a different place, right? It's a very sophisticated economy. They've moved a long time away from family companies. They've moved a long time away from management being shareholders. They're well into the realm of professional executive management who will certainly acting for their shareholders. And if they need to restructure the business to improve the return or to make it survive, then they'll do so. And there's no shame in that anymore, and no stigma attached to that anymore, because they're so far away from the family ownership, the personal ownership, the personal shame which might come from one person onto one person or a small group of people from a business failing, that they've got the freedom to be able to use Chapter 11 and all the others to restructure, and it's part of professional life, right? That's part of capitalism. That's part of risk taking. That's part of taking appropriate risks. Sometimes they don't come off, but it's still.
Is it culture and mentality in your view? Because again, look at your own life and look at life in general. You learn the most from things that actually don't go well, right? I mean, everybody sort of falls down, but it is how you actually get up and move forward and learn from what you have experienced that makes you stronger and more resilient to maybe have another go, and you will succeed. And there are very few stories where, it goes from win to win to win. And my experience, is that if it's too good to be true, it usually is, right? Anything that has achieved, I guess, success has, if you look back, a road of challenges that have been overcome. So how do you change that mentality from, I guess, shame and failure, and therefore naturally denial, because you don't want to talk about it because indeed, it has all these personal negative emotions attached to you, to a situation where, okay, look, business is business. And if you made a decision, it doesn't work out, as long as you're, honest and doing the best you can turn the page and move forward and have another opportunity to have another go. What needs to change? Or is that something that's very difficult to do that from the outside with new fancy laws? It is very much something that needs to come from within in the country.
Yeah. I think there's two parts to that. First is you need to have the right legal system. And we can see that, right? If you go way, way back, right? If you go back hundreds of years, if you couldn't pay your debts, they threw you in jail till you could. Well, You can't pay them if you're in, so that's the origin of bankruptcy, right? Erase people's debts to give them another go. And that traces its way through into the corporation, and then the ability to restructure a corporation and all of these things. So you've got to have a system which allows you to have another go. That's the first thing. And the more free and open those systems are and the more well understood those systems are, the better. And then the second thing I think you need is time and experience. So over time, people will get used to the fact that companies don't always work. And if they don't work, they go into administration or Chapter 11 or into whatever it happens to be. And they emerge and they come out the other side. If the restructuring laws allow you to emerge, then you'll see that. And over time, and given that practice and practice within the whole business community, so this will take a long time, right? But as you move up the ranks of sophistication in the economy and you get more and more towards that professional management ranks and away from the family ownership or the individual personal prestige invested in the business and move away to a board of directors, which is they're doing a job and they've got the rules and there's governance models and all that sort of stuff. It's the time in applying those restructuring rules that make it a normal part of society. And as I say, if you compare where the US is, absolutely normal, not a problem. And the law works pretty well. The management are all executive management. Everyone's very used to the whole procedure and accepting of that as part of business risk, and it works really well. And there's different levels in different countries, right? Some are still throwing people in prison, right? And others are doing sophisticated cross-border restructuring and saving value that way. So I think they're the two things that make the change.
But you have a law, but it also needs to indeed be used. Is there then a big role in education that needs to, I guess, introduce the next generations to the reality of business? And part of business is, financial distress, and there are ways to deal with that. Then obviously you need to have the tools to apply them. And then obviously, you have the practitioners like yourself, but you also have the courts. The US is very much court driven, and ultimately it's the judge that has a very important role to play. The UK, the judge plays a role, but definitely not in the way as the US does it. So there are various ways of actually moving towards a rescue culture. But as you say, it takes time. And in my view, it takes more than just a law to change things. You need to educate, apply, and have hopefully a couple of success stories where you can show that actually it works. And the fact that you can identify cases where you can explain why things happened and that it isn't, fraud, but it is, normal business that occurs, and challenges. Some of them you overcome, some of them you don't overcome, is very important. But it's a difficult one to approach, especially in other cultures that have another approach, and maybe where the language is a barrier.
Yeah.
Would you say that, going back to Australia, that there is a rescue culture there?
There is, and it's changed a lot over the last 10 years. I mean, when I started 30 something years ago, it was very much a, knock them down, bury them, recycle the assets, and away we go. But that's changed a lot, and it is because of changes in the law which allow for restructuring to happen. It is because of history, and as you say, I think you quite rightly point out, there's a third element. The third element is the professionals. The IPs, the lawyers, the courts, the whole system that works together to make this work. And that's been developing quite steadily in Australia in the last 10 years or so particularly. And we're now at the stage where companies go into restructuring quite often. They're starting to emerge more frequently, and we're protecting a lot of value as a result rather than just winding things up. And you need to fit all of that within what has always been a very creditor-orientated system. That is a bit of a challenge to build a rescue culture inside of a creditor-orientated system. But we're doing our best, and the law is changing, and practice is certainly changing. The courts have been very supportive of it, and we've seen some really good success stories. Are we there? No, but are we getting there? Yes, I hope, and it'll get better and better as we move on.
Yeah. So if you look at the 30-odd years that you've been in practice, things have changed, right? I think one thing that has changed is well, the world is smaller, right? So it's a lot more cross-border. Everything goes faster because we have, means of communication that make it go a lot faster. And then there's complexity, right? In various levels. Structures that are more complex, new products that are in there. It's not just a bilateral loan, but they're bonds, they're structured notes, they're all, different pieces in the financial structure that you need to deal with. And yeah, there's an overlay, maybe a sovereign overlay. The government gets involved. There are new players, because that seems to be something that you were talking about. Well, there's all these banks that were in our syndicate in Thailand, but the banks are no longer the main players in certain parts of the world. Is that still the case in your part of the world, or has that changed as well?
Yeah, that's certainly changed. I mean, you wouldn't see a syndicate like we saw in TPI stay together for 10 minutes. And so that's probably the biggest change in the last 10, even 5, even 3 years, is the influence of the special sits players and the distressed debt players, and the way that they really have changed the game. So we rarely see now syndicates of banks. They'll stay in there for a little while, but ultimately they'll probably sell out. And every case that comes up is a little bit faster for people to trade. And so now you've got to think in, another dimension. What happens as the creditor profile changes? What are the objectives of that creditor group? It used to be just to maximize the amount of money, get as much money as I can back as quickly as I can. Well, it's not necessarily the way that people are looking at it anymore.
So what is success in a special situation? Historically, you're saying it was very much focused on, I guess, minimizing losses and
Yep.
maximizing recovery. But if you are, a par holder, you lend the full amount, then obviously, for you to make a profit or, to get a return and not just crystallize loss, you need to get more than the principal back. But if you're a secondary market lender that comes in at a discount, all of a sudden your economics look different from the par holder, which means that, your success is defined in a different way than the bank. And I guess that is good and bad at the same time.
Yeah. And I think it comes down to who you're acting for, right? If you're acting for the company, what does success look like? Success looks like putting the company back on track as a profitable going concern moving forward in a sensible structure, protecting the employees and protecting the productive capacity. So if you're working for the company, that's the type of thing you're doing. If you're working for the banks or the distressed funds, then you're working with them to try and get the best outcome for them, taking into account what their objectives are. And they may want, for example, to own the company and move it forward. They may want to own the company and break it apart. They may, they may have other designs on what to do, merging it with other things, etc. So I think success for us now is being very aware of what your client base wants to happen. Being aware of what your advisors on the other side and what the other side's objectives are going to be, and trying to marry the two up to get a good result for all. But it's certainly got more complex, as you say. The game has become, if it was 3-dimensional before, it's now 4 or 5-dimensional. And it does require a lot more skill on the part of the advisors, particularly the legal teams, I think, to try and find ways through the maze of legal arrangements which are in place in order to achieve where you want to go.
So, what do you think in the space of special situations makes a good lawyer?
Well,
Not being one, and obviously,
not being one,
working
yeah.
with
I can answer it from a sort of observation, I guess. And the observation of good lawyers is people who are first of all pragmatic, right? Not sort of always finding a way to say no, because the legal documents will probably always find a way to say no. And thinking commercially, and trying to find ways to achieve an outcome which suits their client's needs. I mean, it's got to be within the law, of course, and it's got to be within the documents. But there are the best lawyers in the special sits stuff, I think, they're thinking much more on a wide basis than, lawyers used to think. Lawyers used to sit there and people say, well, what does clause 53B2 say? And what does it mean? Well, that's fine. But now you have to think much more about, how do I use that structure? How do I understand that structure? And how do I apply that to get the result that my client wants?
So not only identifying problems, coming up with solutions, and having a more holistic approach towards the situation. So,
Absolutely.
almost using the law in a multidisciplinary way, because it needs to be used with the other, advisors around the hoop, and not just in your, in your lane of legal expertise.
Yeah. And look, as advisors, we're working, the financial types and the lawyers are working much more closely than they used to. Used to be, as you say, you stayed in your lane a little bit. I can advise you on the financial stuff and the others can advise you on the legal stuff. But now, you're in the ring together, and you need to be able to work really well together to be able to get the right outcome and be able to present a practically achievable solution for your clients.
And what does that mean then? If you look at mastering your trade, you as an IP, as a insolvency practitioner, more focused on the financial side, but as you say, actually need to be aware of the legal issues as well. Is it the same characteristics that makes a good lawyer, makes a good IP, or is it different?
I think in the restructuring space, it's very similar. You're almost doing the same job, but you just have a different skill base that you're coming from. And so it's a joy when we get to work with lawyers that are compatible and have the right attitude. And I hope they feel the same coming back the other way. But you're almost doing the same job, but you're just doing it with a different toolbox. And, you put both of you together and you can get really good outcomes. The other skill I think that pairing has to bring, good communication and good negotiation skills, because whatever we're doing, we're almost always trying to bring a group of people together, whether it's a group of lenders or special sits people together to do something, or a group of unsecured creditors to do something, or the employees to support something, or the management to support something, or some things we need from the government, whatever it is. Our job in leading these restructurings is as much about communication and negotiation as just about anything else. And that's jointly shared by the lawyers and by the.
So if you had to sort of come up with a couple of characteristics, maybe negative ones and positive ones that you need to have to do well in special situations, what would they be? I mean, do you need to be like more an entrepreneurial type? Do you need to be more a manager? Do you need to be a technician? Do you need to be, a little bit of all of those? What about your appetite to risk? What about your, eye to detail? All of these things, what would be the top three that you should have, and the top three that you actually shouldn't have, or, that are red flags maybe for you doing well in this space?
Good question. I mean, I think you've got to start with a good technical base, and you've got to know your stuff, right? That just goes without saying. But, the best lawyers I've worked with are the ones that, that they know, right? If you ask them a question, they're on it straight away. They know the law, they know the contracts, they know the setup, they know everything. And they're always across all of that stuff, and they somehow can manage all of that. And the same with the IPs. You've got to be across the numbers, you've got to be across the business, you've got to be across the environment. And
I think, Peter, one thing that I've learned that is also very important is, since we're dealing with so many different aspects of the law or, a business, it's equally important to know what you don't know. Right. And you need to have the confidence to be able to identify something that is important, but where you need to bring somebody in. So that to me is part of the toolbox that obviously over time you learn a lot more. But being overconfident or ignoring things that you just, are not very well versed in, but it is important, that's very risky.
Yeah, and I think you hit on that. That was the sort of second layer, I reckon, is that you've got to be able to bring the skills to bear to be able to understand things quickly. And we all get involved in different industries. Every matter that we look at is typically in a different industry. You could be looking at a power station one day, a restaurant the next day, a casino another day, whatever it happens to be. We get good at adapting to businesses and understanding businesses, but bringing in some expertise in the industry, I've found is invaluable. So I think you're right. The second sort of layer then is knowing what you don't know, getting the help you need to be able to quickly come up to speed with things so that you can get your head around the business problem here. Because really the best people are the ones who can solve the business problem. And so how do you start that? You have your technical expertise, you have your knowledge of the industry and the business, and then you have your creativity on top to try and match what your clients want to do with what other people want to do in order to build a proper setup. As to the things not to have, I mean, you don't want someone who is a bad communicator. You don't want someone who's overly technical unless they're paired with someone who's side by side with one of their colleagues who happens to be really good on the business side. That can work. I've seen plenty of times where you've got a really nerdy accountant or a nerdy lawyer who sits alongside the good communicator, and that can work. But you can't just have pure head down misunderstanding the business issues and just being, really, really focused on our technical skills. That's not going to be enough in the restructuring space.
And maybe coming back to what you started at the conversation to explain is you probably also need to have an appetite for, I guess, being outside of your comfort zone, because that is almost guaranteed the case. Nothing is quite the same. Obviously, there are, a number of things that are universal when there is financial distress. But it is amazing how, tailor-made things usually need to be, which means that, precedents are great to have, but it's not cookie cutter in most of the situations. And you need to be the type that actually enjoys that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, this has never been done before, but okay. Can we do it? Yes. Does it fit this case? Yeah. Let's do it. Let's go. And the bespoke design is where the real cleverness is in these things, right?
Yeah. So how did you, because I think you're quite right in saying that the technical base is a given and a foundation, but how did you acquire that in your career? Because these days it's all about identifying and finding mentors, and how do you learn? And obviously, a lot more is online as opposed to in person. What worked for you in terms of learning the trade?
Well, I was fortunate to have a lot of good mentors. I mean, when I came into Ferrier Hodgson, a lot of the partners, I was, 17, 18, but a lot of the partners were 25 or 26. They were very young. Like, you can't imagine it now. And so we basically stayed with a lot of them all the way. And, that's that learning from, straight out of school, straight into the workforce. And learning how to do things technically and practically, I think, is probably the biggest thing. And then I think experiencing other cultures and other systems, it makes you think wider and makes you think about other ways to do things. And that's been really helpful, I think, in sort of developing the base of thinking which I can bring to things now. I mean, I wouldn't have the same sort of thought pattern if I didn't go to the US, if I didn't go to Thailand, if I didn't go to Singapore, go to Japan. I just wouldn't think the same way. I think that's, if I could encourage people to do anything in your career, I'd be encouraging people to, get out and go and experience other parts of the world.
If you can.
And it's fantastic.
And yeah, no, I fully agree with that. So maybe because you've explained a number of things that are quite intense, you start with, maybe 2 weeks and then you end up 6 years on a case. That's pretty full on. So this is not a job that is easy to do 9 to 5. It's not a job. It's actually, a career, I guess, a part of your life. So how much does your profession sort of define who you are?
Yeah, I mean, you can't help but your profession defining who you are. I mean, and as you say, this is not a 9 to 5 job, right? And it does impinge on your lifestyle quite a bit. And we had one job in Singapore a little while ago where a colleague and I, we had to commute from Sydney to Singapore every week for 9 months, right? So, Friday night, we'd be getting a plane back from Singapore overnight, and we'd arrive here Saturday morning and try and do something with the family Saturday. But lunchtime on Sunday, you're heading back to the airport. You do that for 9 months, and it takes a real toll on you and on your family and on your health. I mean, I think I put on 1 kilo a month for 9 months, and until recently, I was living with them. So it was it took you have to put your body on the line for some of these jobs. But I think there's also it raises an issue of balance, right? It's a stressful job. It's a tough job. And one of the things I learned from my sort of mentor I was working with in Thailand was, when you're at work, you're at work. But when you're off, you're off. And he was really good at doing that. You know, if we got in the car after a long day and we were heading to the pub for a beer in the car, if I started to talk about work, he'd say, stop, we're not in the office anymore. Off the clock. Now we're going to relax. And it's something that stuck with me a lot, you know, that ability to say, I'm on. When I'm on, I'm really on. When I'm off, I'm off. And making sure you get that balance. So while it defines who you are, I think it's really important not to let it dominate who you are and have interests outside of work and challenges outside of work. And I think as you get older and older in your career, you need that. You really need some challenges outside of what you do. Otherwise, you'll get consumed by work, I think, and I've seen it happen for a number of people. And you know, when they end up getting towards retirement, they've got nothing else to do, or they burn themselves out
because
in
it
the middle
has
of their
been
career.
their whole life, and therefore, you know,
That's right.
yeah. And I mean, look, I know you're a family man. You know, I'm a family man. Actually, you know, we have more in common than just our first names. You know, we both married
Yep.
somebody from, you know, Asia. You're in Thailand, me in South Korea. And you know, the points you made about seeing various perspectives if you go into a new culture. I mean, you know, to a certain extent, it's no similar in the family setting, right?
That's right.
You can have a perspective and, you know, a way of looking at it, but there may be another person who has, you know, an equally valid perspective on the other side.
Yep.
And you need to be able to recognize that and, you know, deal with that. And in my mind, I think what tripped me up early on in my career is that, you know, as long as I thought I had the right intentions with what I'm doing, then, you know, that makes everything okay. But actually, as we've discussed, there is various ways of looking at the same set of things. So how do you, in a career like this, make sure that on the home front, you're sort of okay as well? Are there any sort of, you know, golden tips or things to do or not to do to make, you know, put you in a good position?
Well, I've learned plenty of the things not to do, Peter, as I'm sure you've probably learned that as well. And
Absolutely.
maybe everyone in a relationship's learned that. But look, I think it's a matter of providing them with enough time, listening as much as you can, and understanding that people are coming from a different perspective and they're living a different lifestyle from you, and it's very different. And you need to be able to understand where they're coming from, and that's probably the hardest challenge.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're busy, if you're traveling a lot, if you don't have much time. It is probably the hardest challenge of life, I think, you know, trying to maintain relationships.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to another, I think, aspect that I've been thinking about quite a bit is, so if you look back in your career, did you set yourself goals that you want to achieve? You know, is it sort of mapped out? And how do you go about actually achieving these goals and setting, you know, other goals? My experience personally has been for a long time that you set yourself a goal, you work towards it. Before you achieve it, you've set yourself a new goal. You achieve the old goal, but, you know, there's no time to actually reflect or, you know, celebrate any of that because there's another one that you've already set yourself and you just continue to go. Yeah. And it's sort of, you know, you're in this, the hamster wheel, the rat race, and before you know it, you'll be running. And yeah, it's a little bit of a moving target as well because you set yourself out, it adjusts, and that is, well, it's risky and it can have a lot of negative consequences. And for me, it sort of, you know, brought back into maybe a different perspective, the need after, you know, a transaction, which usually, you know, happened in the past more maybe than it does now. You have a closing dinner, you have like, you know, a tombstone. There is something to celebrate because if you don't, you know, you're running, you know, to the next thing and there's never time to actually learn or reflect on anything. To me, that's been a very tricky thing in, you know, the profession. And I wonder whether, you know, you have a similar experience or you have like, you know, ways of dealing with that, you know, in a better way than most of the times I've done it.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Celebrate your victories. Again, a mentor of mine once told me, make sure you celebrate your victories. And it's really important. I'll tell a little story. When we we're doing that TPI job, we finally got a big piece of the deal done, a big debt to equity swap, a $3.7 billion debt for equity swap. And when we finally got it done, we all went out to the fanciest hotel in Bangkok, and he got the champagne menu and all this sort of stuff out, and outrageously expensive set of champagne, bottles of champagne. And then it came, we'd been there for a little while, and the boss then orders up another bottle, and they didn't have the bottles we were drinking, but there was this other one, and it was, I can't remember how much it was $10,000 a bottle, something completely out of the realm.
Yeah.
And I said to him, Tony, we've already had a few drinks. It's okay. We don't need to do this. And he said, Peter, have you ever done a $3.7 billion debt for equity swap before? And I said, no. And he said, are you ever likely to do one again? And I said, no. And he said, shut up and drink your champagne. I remember it to this day. That embodies the principle, right? Celebrate your victories. When you get something done, pat yourself on the back a little bit and do something special to market. Otherwise, as you say, you're on the hamster wheel. You just run, and you sort of feel like you never achieve anything, even though you are achieving things all the way along. You just never stop and appreciate it. And I think it's really important for us, but also for our staff. There's a lot of people who work with us and help us, and I think we've got to help them celebrate their victories as they go through as well. Otherwise, they won't appreciate the job. They won't stay with us, and they won't become long-term restructuring professionals.
Yeah. I mean, that brings me to, I guess, something that is more recent. And maybe, we both have kids that are the first generation of very much being part of that, is like social media and everything relating to that, how much of an impact it has on life and practice. And going back to, what we discussed earlier, failure, right? Financial distress associated with failure, success, requires failure in order to get success. It's never a straight line. In this environment that we're in now, or at least our kids in the next generation are in, it is so focused on only showing good things and never, actually dealing with the more challenging things. But the more challenging things are, essential in your profession in order to achieve success. Well, my first question to you is, what are your thoughts on that? And maybe do you have, an example that, would resonate of, a situation where it didn't go as you would want it to go, and it was maybe a failure, but actually, you were allowed to learn from it and move on, and actually, it helped create another success. And is that something that you think, is still possible in this day and age, or is it going to be a lot more difficult to deal with quote unquote failure because of the focus on success and the short attention span that everybody has, right? I mean, we're having a longer conversation, which, I actually enjoy simply because we can get to stuff in a little bit more detail. It's not like, 1 minute pre-agreed and vetted lines that are exchanged and we move on. And we don't have any substance in our conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is a real challenge for the next generation. And, you see it all the time with sports stars, right? I mean, their job is, there'll be successes and there'll be failures because they're in a competitive environment by their very nature. But you hear stories and you see some of the things that people who are supposed to be fans of the game they're playing or whatever are writing horrible, horrible things about sports stars who, maybe haven't done as well as they wanted to do on a particular instance. And they will be, there's some, I think that's a real problem when people can use social media to, say really terrible things to people who are clearly trying their best and are operating in an environment where failure is a normal thing, right? Because you're in a competitive environment. And I think, I haven't seen it happen so much social media in the profession, but, there is always scuttlebutt and stuff around the market and people can be quite hurtful and quite tough about things that don't always go right. And I think, as you said right back at the beginning of our discussion, they're the things you learn the most from, when things don't go right. Personally, I think you learn a bit of strength and resilience out of them, as tough as they are. But for kids growing up these days, they're not going to want to show any of that stuff, right? They're going to want to hide that stuff away because they know people are going to jump on them. So I do fear that it's going to be a much more difficult thing. I mean, I have a teenage daughter at the moment, and teenage kids go through a lot. And thankfully, we haven't had too much issues with social media that I'm that aware of. But I know some of her friends have had some really bad experiences. So
Yeah.
it's going to be tough for them. I don't know how it resolves itself. We need to make sure that it stays out of the professional world, and we need to be able to be outside our comfort zone, as you've said before, in order to do our job.
One thing that sort of occurs to me related to this is you've sort of explained the role that you play, if you're appointed and you're sort of in the middle of a restructuring, helping the company getting from A to B. There's a lot of stakeholders around. There's a lot of pressure on, it being a success. Have you experienced, I guess, situations where there were personal attacks on you, threats of claims, and, or, just accusations? And how do you deal with that? And how important is it that, I guess, the shop you're in actually has your back in that situation? Because again, it goes back to the point of everybody, if you do stuff, people are going to have something to say about it. If you don't do anything, well, nothing happens, right?
Exactly. Now, we did have a case recently. It was a food manufacturing company that had, expanded their facilities really aggressively and chased volume. And volume, whenever you're chasing volume, it comes with low margin, right, as you'd know. And so they had a really big problem. We worked, my colleague and I and our whole team worked super hard to get this thing, keep it alive, keep it operating, keep all the employees employed. And all the time there was a fair bit of, the element of management and some of the workers working against us, right? Because they wanted to see us fail, and they sort of thought that, if we can make you guys fail, then, the owner will come back in, the big guy will come back in and take it all back over again, and we don't like you guys, and blah, blah, blah. So there was a lot of pushing through that. It then morphed into that owner, taking actions against us or threatening actions against us as we started to investigate what he'd been doing. We got publicly examined. It was the first time in my career I've been publicly examined. Normally it's the other way around, right? The IP examining the directors. But this time they got permission from the regulator, and then the director could examine us about the work we were doing, which that's difficult. I've been in the witness box many times, but my colleague hadn't. And so it was pretty tough to sit there and have people, attacking you for a day or two about what you've been doing, accusing you of all sorts of things, when actually you put your heart and soul into getting a good result. And we did get a good result at the end. The business was sold, the business continued, everyone kept their jobs, and it's still operating to this day. So while we were really proud of the outcome, it was really difficult. And people making accusations against you, but I think that's one of the other attributes, I think, of a good restructuring professional, right? You got to have your armor on, or you got to have, what do they say? You got to have a hide like a rhinoceros, right? And you just got to let stuff bounce off you because it's coming at you.
Yep.
It's coming at you all the time, and you have to remind yourself it's not personal. You're the person who was parachuted in to fix it. And yes, people will be upset.
That's right, but it's hard not to take it personally if people, attack
it's
you.
Hard, but I think that's one thing you've got to learn early on. You just got to let it bounce off your armor. You cannot let it get to you. If you let it, you won't be able to do this job if you let it get to you.
Yeah. So is there maybe a sort of more general question about, is there like a life's philosophy that you have that you've sort of applied to the profession, or has the profession sort of given you tools to formulate your own life philosophy and you apply it? Is there a theme for you, that comes out of the experiences that you've had in your profession?
Very good question. Not that I'm really conscious of, I guess, but a lot of it, I think, comes around to that, have a go, be outside your comfort zone, and back yourself and take chances, right? When I went to Thailand and just went there for a short time and then stayed there for a long time, and as I was there, then I was opening an office, that was a risk. And then I was running a petrochemical complex with 7,000 people, that was a risk. And then there was all the personal security stuff around, and I decided to stay when others decided to leave, well, that was a risk. And then when we went to Japan, that was a risk. There's sort of sliding doors moments, right? People open doors around you all the time, and you've got to actually make the decision to walk through them.
Yeah. So you need to have an open mind. You need to be able to, take opportunities.
That's right. And, the merger of Ferrier Hodgson and KPMG, right? The opportunity came up. We weren't looking for it. The opportunity came up and we approached it like everything else. We analyzed it. We thought about it. We thought about whether it would be good for people, whether it would solve problems, whether it would create problems and that sort of thing. And we decided that, hey, the door's open. Let's walk through it. And a lot of people would have just said, no, I'm not going to walk through that. I'm going to walk away. So I think that's part of the philosophy. You have to look for opportunities and be prepared to take them.
And that's, we sort of touched upon it at the start. That decision of KPMG to approach you and actually, bring you in the structure is almost like, a contrarian view because, for many years, and we've seen the consequences, all the restructuring groups spun out of the big four, KPMG as well, in my part of the world, as you know, but the same with Deloitte it's, PwC still, but EY, you can see it sort of, it's a trend that has happened. But do you think that trend is changing and actually, institutions like KPMG going forward will be, big players again? Because there was a time that they dominated everything.
Yeah.
Then there came a lot of other players in the game, and their position was, at least on the restructuring and insolvency side, a little bit compromised compared to what it was before. Do you think there is, a new chapter being written where they will again, have a big role to play?
I'm not sure it's a trend, but I think they're for our type of business, which is cyclical, as we said, more counter-cyclical to what they're doing. It requires some out-of-the-box thinking for an accounting firm like a Big Four, and they have to be willing to stick at it for the long term. And they have to appreciate it for its counter-cyclical nature, but they also have to appreciate it for the skills we bring for other parts of the business. More and more in the 6 years we've been at KPMG, we've been starting to be used more and more by the other parts of the firm to do different things because our skill set is a little bit transportable, but it requires the management of a Big Four to think very openly and to have a sort of steely resolve to stay with you. And I think a lot of the times when firms spin out and go on to independence, it's because there isn't that steely resolve to look at your value that you bring to the business in the long term rather than just in the short term.
But isn't one of the problems for at least large institutions like, the Big Four, you have the same thing in large law firms, that it's almost, as difficult to convince a client to, hire you as it is a colleague to bring you in, because they believe that you're bad news, and therefore, bringing you is the wrong thing to do because it sends the wrong message. But again, as we've many times sort of try to explain, the earlier you bring us in, the more options there are. Is there a change that you've noticed in that respect? Or are you saying, actually, it's not so much that, it is just we're trying to use our skills in a different way and find new things that we can do that are not necessarily restructuring, but our skill set can be used in that way?
Yeah. It's a bit of both, but on the first bit, trying to get colleagues to bring you in, that's been our massive challenge from the beginning, and we knew it'd be our challenge from the beginning. And a lot of it goes towards educating what those other partners in actually what we do. Initially, they say, if I bring you in, you're going to put them in liquidation. I say, I can't put them in liquidation. I have a conflict of interest. You're the auditor. I can't be the liquidator. So the only thing I can do is help you save them. And they think, oh, okay, all right. So we're on the
same side.
We're on the same side, and we have a client's interest at heart. And so we're not going to do anything which is not right. And frankly, if we get there and they do need to go into administration or liquidation, if it's that bad, then we'll refer them to someone who'll look after them properly. But if it has to happen, it has to happen, right? There's no point not telling them because we don't want to give them the bad news. And it comes back to that end-to-end service of your clients. Big Four firms and all firms should be looking to, and the same for the law firms, you've got to be able to look after your clients in the good times and the bad times. It'd be terrible if your client was having some trouble and you said, sorry, I can't help you, go over there to those other people, and these other people treated them badly, and you'd lose a client. right? And you wouldn't be doing the right thing by that client. So I think there is a mindset you've got to have of, there are times when clients need all sorts of different skills and we should be able to provide all of them. So that education piece, we're getting better and better and better at it. As to the other part of using our skills in different ways, a lot of it comes around the industry experience we've built up. Because we, in a big four firm, no one's actually run businesses. They're the auditor, the tax accountant, whatever. They've never run a business. So when they get a situation where they need someone with some hands-on skills, if it's a petrochemical plant, for example, right? This has happened. And they said, well, gee, we don't have anyone with experience. I said, well, hang on, I've run one for 6 years or 4 years. Oh, really?
Yeah.
How'd you do that? And so they explain it to them and they say, okay, fine. We've run coal mines, power stations, restaurants, pubs, whatever it happens to be, sporting organizations, all these things. So when people have questions or need some industry expertise, we can provide them. And we have a whole string of, friends of ours. We talked before about bringing in industry experts to help you when you get into a particular industry. We've got a whole pile of those people who we can introduce into a situation to help a client get through even if it's a merger or an acquisition, for example, doing due diligence on things. So there's many different ways we can use our skill set, from technical skills to business skills to industry skills. And that I think adds a lot of value to the firm. I mean, there is still the trend now, it seems to be picking up again, of Big Four getting out of this game and it all going to boutiques. But it's certainly happening in Australia with Alvarez and Marsal coming in and Teneo coming in and Interpath looking around and Kroll coming in, those sort of people. But we'll see. At the moment, it's working well for us. It's a slightly, may end up being a bit of an outlier of a model, but as long as it works for us and for the firm, then I think it should continue.
Yeah. Can we maybe go back to Australia for a moment? I mean, do you feel like, being part of that jurisdiction has helped you a lot in your career, in cross-border settings? Or do you believe that actually, it hasn't helped because in, the sort of cross-border setting, it's like US and UK dominated, and or what are your views on that? In which jurisdiction you are, does it make a difference for the sort of career that you have, or have you actually because it sounds like you've been almost maybe an outlier in terms of being in the driver's seat in a lot of cross-border situations where Australian law wasn't sort of the driving force.
Yeah, look, I think you are limited a bit being at the end of the earth down here. It's a lovely place to live, but it is a small market, and it is a very accreditor-orientated system, and it is a rather insular system. But I think those couple of years I spent across in the US really helped me understand the US system. And then more and more we're finding situations where US companies have Australian assets, or there's Australian companies listed in the US. And so we are seeing cross-border stuff going backwards and forwards there. Getting involved in that stuff is really fascinating. We're seeing more and more cases. What I really would have liked to have done is spend a bit of time in your part of the world, where you're doing, some the UK schemes and the Dutch WOAs
and the RPs, that we now have.
Where you're in the European market, and I've got a business which has an Italian manufacturing and a Spanish division and a German division, and we're doing a UK scheme, and that'd be fascinating, I think. But unfortunately, I haven't really had the opportunity to do too much of that. I had little peripheral touches on the European stuff, but plenty of the stuff with the US. But the good news is Australia's open to all of that. I mean, we have adopted the model law a long time ago, and it's being put to pretty good use. And, we've done a lot of cases where it's been helpful. And, the multinational cooperation between courts, between Australia and New Zealand, we do a lot. We did a big case called Halifax Financial, which was a court-to-court protocol and worked really well, where we did sort of tandem restructurings of a large investment house. So that stuff's really interesting. Unfortunately, we don't get as much of a chance to do it down here. But anyone who does get the opportunity to do some cross-border stuff, particularly in Europe or in the US, dive into it, because I think that's the most fascinating part of what we do.
And, in that respect, probably also being active in a trade organization like Insol International is beneficial for that, because it brings everybody together. It forges, relationships that you can professionally use. And maybe it also creates at times opportunities where you can get involved in stuff that otherwise you wouldn't get involved in.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that I was involved in Insolve for a long time, and then of course we met doing the global insolvency practice course that they run. Highly recommend that to anyone who wants to do international insolvency. And those organizations not only help everyone learn, but it helps create that network you talked about. So if I do have a case in the US, I know I can pick up the phone to Rick Pedoni in New York and say, hey, Rick, to bounce something off you, or do you know about this case or whatever? And he could do the same to me. He could do the same to you. And, we've got a really good collegiate group inside that international insolvency professionals, and it gets tied together with people like Insol, people like TMA, those sort of organizations. I think everyone
Yeah.
should find one that sort of you gravitate to, volunteer your time, give some back to the profession, and get to meet great people and learn good stuff.
And you've done also work with the World Bank, which is another sort of organization that
Yeah.
gives you an opportunity to do cross-border stuff, but from a different angle.
Yeah, they've had me out, teaching insolvency law and practice to the judges and to the insolvency practitioners in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia. They even sent me to Rwanda at one point. So I was short notice off to Rwanda, going to teach people. I never thought I'd be flying to Rwanda to do a case, but
Well, we can
fascinating
shake hands
experience.
there because I was there, in Kigali last year.
Right.
Also helping out a very fascinating country, and obviously, Africa as a continent also, fascinating,
Yeah.
and I think a lot can still happen in that continent and the various jurisdictions there. But maybe going back to, I guess, the beginning of our conversation about the stigma, the culture, the mentality, that is something that, my limited experience in a couple of these jurisdictions is that is an impediment. And
Yeah.
then, having to, well, develop a group of professionals that actually, help change that mentality, and then having the tools to actually apply and help change that mentality, and then have judges that actually have the capacity to facilitate things as well, and all of that needs to work together in order for, I guess, the man and woman in the street to believe, well, actually, this is something that we may use, because otherwise, I guess people run a mile. It is this sort of, the metaphor of the doctor, right? If you have a little ailment, last thing you want to do is go to the doctor. You're just going to walk it off, right? And that is exactly the same with businesses and financial distress. People
Yeah.
just don't want to recognize it.
Yeah, and I think that's where the World Bank's they're hitting the mark with that program, right? They're developing the legal system. They're working with the government to get the legal system right. They're working with the courts to make sure that the judiciary can apply the law the right way. They're working with insolvency practitioners and lawyers to be able to generate that pool of professionals that can put it all into practice. So you've got that sort of base thing. You've got to have the law and the legal system and the practice. And then after that, you need to apply it and apply it and apply it and apply it. And over time, people get used to it and get used to understanding what it means. And then it's not so shameful. And that as the economy develops and as you move away from family run companies and individual sponsors to more professional organizations and stock markets and executive directors and executive management, then you end up where the US is now. But it didn't start that way in the US either, right? It's taken a
Yeah.
long, long time, and in Europe and in the UK, Australia, to get to the point where you have this separation between ownership and management, and the sophistication to be able to do that. And then once you're there and you have the system and people have seen that system work for a long time and they know what the outcomes are going to be, then the stigma starts to dissolve away.
Is the predictability, right? People want to know, even if the outcome isn't great, you need to be able what you can, predict what is going to happen so that you can price it in. Uncertainty or complete unpredictability is very expensive because,
That's right. And
yeah,
if for nothing else, it bogs down the process.
yeah,
If you have a
exactly.
company which is in distress, the worst thing you can do is do nothing.
Well, exactly, because you're doing nothing is doing something, right? But it's not of your own
It's not fixing anything,
choosing.
right? I mean,
No, exactly, it isn't.
if you're going to fix it, you've got to do something to fix it. And if you have a legal system which just bogs you down and takes, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, some jurisdictions longer to get anything done, then obviously you're not going to solve the problem and you're not going to improve economic efficiency or or productive capacity in the economy. So you've got to have a
Oh,
system which allows you to do stuff and get it done quickly and get it
yeah.
out of the way.
So if we sort of looked at the past and the present, what about the future? If you, well, obviously for yourself, you've been around for a while, and I've been around for a while, not as long as you, but getting there. I very much, want to continue finding a way to, contribute and provide value. The situation, well, I guess globally is on the geopolitical level is a lot more difficult to assess these days. It
Yeah.
has a huge impact on any practice, including our practice, whether that's good or bad. The jury is still out. You have, I guess, the continuous conversation about AI and how it's going to work or not work, and help or not help in various jurisdictions. What are your sort of views on things going forward for yourself and sort of the practice that we're both in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited to keep plowing away. I mean, I think that it takes a long time to build up this experience, and so now I always look forward to applying it as much as I can. In terms of where the industry goes, I mean, we're all dependent on economic cycles, of course, and a big part of those economic cycles is uncertainty. And well, I can't see a time in the world ever before where uncertainty is as high as it is now. So there is going to be a lot happening, and a lot of change, and a lot of change brings a lot of disruption, and a lot of disruption brings a lot of work. So I think that anyone who's in the industry and looking forward, I think there's going to be a fair amount of restructuring work to do in the next sort of 10 years or so, and it should be a really exciting time. As for technology and AI and all that sort of stuff, very hard to know how it changes things. It will change things. I remember going back when, I'll show my age now, when we brought in PCs, right? And you got your first
Or
computer,
Blackberries for that matter.
Blackberries, all that sort of stuff. And
It's
I
like,
remember them saying, "Here's this program, this spreadsheet program called Excel." And all you kids are not going to have a job, right? Because Excel's going to do everything for you, right? And the partner will be able to do it directly. The partner's never going to do it directly, right? The partner's always going to need someone who's younger, brighter, smarter, faster to be able to use that software to produce more. So I don't really see AI or the others, taking jobs away. I think they just change the way we do our job. And it does mean things move even faster. I mean, you think about how fast we're moving now compared to the days where, one of my partners always harks back to the days when, you had an issue. So you typed up a letter and you put it in an envelope and you put a stamp on it and you sent it. And a week later, it'd arrive at the other end, and the person at the other end would get it, and they'd open it up and they'd have a read about it, have a think about it. And okay, they'd decide their position. They'd then write another letter back to you, put it in an envelope, send it back. So 2 weeks later, you've had one exchange on one issue. Well, we do that, 50 times a day on every issue you possibly can now. And that'll just get faster and faster and faster. So it's not
which
going
is
to
not
get,
always a good thing, I think, because
no,
sometimes
it makes it very difficult.
time resolves issues, right?
It does. It
And
does. But look,
and
I think
immediate
you've got to
responding to
embrace all of
stuff.
that stuff, right? All the tools which are available to us, you embrace. You can't fight it. It's like the cultures we were talking about before. There's no point saying, no, my way is better than the other way.
Yeah.
You use the tools that are available to get your job done as quickly and as efficiently and as accurately as you can, and look to the result that you're producing. So I think it's exciting moving forward, and I look forward to doing it for many years yet.
Excellent. Hey, maybe closing out with if there is anybody out there these days that actually focuses, wants to be in the space of special situations, and I think the industry has grown in such a way that it is almost, well, it is a profession on its own legs,
Yeah.
and it may very well be one of the things that people are considering as a job opportunity. What would be your advice to the next generation if they're considering this?
I'd say jump in on it, because it's the most exciting branch of business that you can be in, I think. You're dealing with a different industry every day, different companies every day, different people, different situations, different legal environments, different documents, different governments, different legal. The whole thing is different every day. And to me, that's what makes an exciting career. I don't think I could, if I started my career and I was the CFO of some company and just doing the business of that company, same company, day in, day out, month in, month out, I think I would go mad.
Yeah.
So I think anyone who thinks that they have the sort of ability to deal with that uncertainty and to deal with that variety, and is looking for an exciting career in turnaround restructuring business, I'd say jump into it. Have a go. Have a go.
And where would you start? Because you need to learn the skills, right? An institution like KPMG is a great place to start. Or would you say actually, there are many ways into the business that gets you the skills that you need?
Yeah, I don't think it matters whether it's a big firm or a small firm. I mean, I started at a tiny firm, 35 people working there, and now moved up. The law firms would be the same, right? Some of the kids start in some of these big law firms, but they get the life wrung out of them in the first couple of years because it's so brutal that and that's good for some people. Some people love that, right? I want to go in there. I want to work 12 hours a day, and I want to climb the ladder really fast and work for a big high profile company. But others might be better suited to a smaller, more boutique, nimble outfit. And I think it's a matter of what you want to do and where you want to go and where you see the opportunity, right? But jump into it and jump into it early, and try and then find a type of work and an industry which you really like. I think that's one of the key things. If you can find an industry that you really like, an industry sector. So if you really like the retail industry, then start focusing on that. If you really like mining, then start looking at that. If you really like hospitality, start thinking about that. And start to develop your skills in that industry, because as your technical skills as a restructuring practitioner or a lawyer come up, then you've got this extra skill that not many other people have. And then, you might have been really following and trying to do as much work in the hospitality industry as you can. And again, as one of my other partners said, if you're going to make it in the market, you have to be famous for something. And
So you need to find,
he's famous for being across the retail industry, right? He's the retail guru. Other people are really good at, if you've got a mine, a coal mine, that's the person to go to. If you've got a cattle station, that's the person to go to. And so it makes your life of winning work in the market, which is one of the hardest things that we have to do. Doing the work sometimes easy. Trying to win it is the really hard part. And if you're famous for something and it's something that you like doing, which means you'll stick at it, I think that makes life a lot easier in the long run.
So what are you famous for, Pete?
Oh, for my sins, power stations, petrochemical plants, coal mines, all that sort of heavy industry stuff. I don't know how, I don't know why. Maybe it's that, early penchant towards chemical engineering still coming to the fore, never quite shaken it off. So maybe that's why I've ended up where I've ended up. But, that's the way it goes.
And your dad fully, appreciates and comprehends what you're doing, or is he sort of, yeah.
Yeah, he does. He sometimes make a quiet thing. Said, "Oh, I saw you in the paper the other day." It's nice, But I think he directed me on the right path early on, and that was a great thing for him to do. But yeah, now when I'm running some sort of power station or something, and I go into that control room and I see all the engineers sitting there twiddling their dials and looking at their screens, I have a little think to myself that I made the right decision.
Yeah, you could be there. And sort of outside of work, you're finding the boat, well, sailing, the great. Is there anything with sailing that sort of, helps you in your profession, or is it just like it's so different from the profession that is what helps the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think the latter in some ways, just it's a completely different way of thinking, and you're not sitting at a desk looking at a computer. I'm still looking at a computer because I'm a navigator, but I'm doing it on the deck of a boat in the ocean. But I think doing something different and having an outlet and another challenge. We talked before about having a challenge outside of work is really important, and doing something different is really important. And try and find something which challenges you, which builds your resilience, right? I mean, offshore yacht racing, I can tell you, builds a lot of resilience, but and toughness, and that sort of goes hand in hand with work. But I think the main thing is do something different, have another challenge in your life to balance the balance.
Yeah, well, that's great. And actually it is something that, funnily enough, I think there are quite a number of people in the profession that like sailing as something outside. It is another challenge that a number of practitioners have found, at least people that I know.
Yeah.
Pete, I want to thank you for, this conversation. I think we've gone around the houses and touched on a lot of things.
We've covered a lot of ground, I think.
I really appreciate it. I hope that, everybody who listens until, this point in the conversation enjoyed it as well. And, more conversations to come. And, well, again, thank you very much, Pete.
No, thank you very much, mate. And look, great to see your business doing well and your practice doing well. And you're a great mate and a great practitioner. And so always love to see your face. So I
You're,
hope you're
you're,
doing well.
you're, you're you're very kind. You're very kind.